The vertebrates, the skeletal system, the circulatory system, a two-chambered, a three-chambered, and a four-chambered heart. Our respiratory system that aids in the exchange of gases. The nervous system, clearly not as intelligent as a human. Up next, we have the digestive system. And this system, as its name implies, helps us to digest food. Again, we are animals. These are vertebrae. Vertebrates are animals, which means that we are not producers, we are consumers. We cannot make our own food. We have to eat other things in order to survive. And so we have a digestive system that is designed to help us do that. Technically speaking, the digestive system starts in the mouth, where things actually start to dissolve from our saliva. But once we swallow our food, it travels down this tube known as the esophagus. And if you remember, we talked about the esophagus because worms like flatworms and roundworms and even annelids, they all have an esophagus that helps them to move their food down to where it needs to go. And so we have this esophagus, the food travels down the esophagus, and then eventually it's going to reach the stomach. Now, if you're looking at our chicken here, if you're following along as I went through, it doesn't say stomach, it says crop. And if you remember when we talked about the worms, specifically the annelids, are earthworms, we talked about how they have what's known as a crop and a gizzard. And I told you guys that so did chickens and different birds. And crops and gizzards are basically different methods of a stomach for different animals. It's still part of the digestive system, but it works a little bit differently for these animals. And so chickens, like others, have the crop where they're going to store it, and then they have their gizzards where that mechanical processing is going to take place. And then eventually it leads into the small and large intestines. Looking at some of our mammal stomachs, you can even see that there's variation within mammal stomachs. So for example, something like a deer here is very similar to a cow in the sense that they have what's called a four-chambered stomach. And some people say that they have four stomachs, which technically you could say is true, but really it's just one big stomach that's divided into four chambers. Saying that they have four stomachs is like saying we have four hearts. We only have one heart, it's just four chambers. And so what happens here, though, is they do have an area known as the rumen. And this is the area that, like cows will often have, and like when they eat something like grass, they'll actually throw it up and then chew it again in their mouth. And this is actually talked about in the Bible. It's what's referred to as chewing the cud. And what happens is these animals will eat things. If you notice, this animal has a very long intestinal tract, and we're going to talk about that in a second, why they do. But these animals will eat things like grass. Grass is really hard to digest because of the cellulose. All plant matter is really hard for our bodies to digest. It doesn't work well with it. That's why oftentimes we refer to it as fiber, because it doesn't get digested well. But to help with that digestion and to try and get as many nutrients from that material as possible, God has designed some of these animals to be able to do what's called chew the cud. And so they will eat something like grass, they will chew on it for a while, and then they'll swallow it, and it goes into the rumen where it kind of starts to ferment and dissolve and get mushy. As this happens, eventually the animal will kind of throw it back up into its mouth, and it will start to chew it again with its mouth, doing that mechanical digestion, trying to grind it up even more. And that's what's referred to in the Bible as chewing the cud. And so if you're ever reading in your Bible, in the Old Testament, it talks about animals that are clean to eat, and it talks about animals that chew the cud or eat the cud are clean organisms. And so that's what it's referring to in the Bible. Now, again, another thing that you notice, like I said, animals that are going to chew the cud, that have these four-chambered stomachs, they're also going to have a very long intestinal tract. And the reason for that is because what these small intestines are doing is, as the food has gone through the stomach and it starts to make its way into the intestines, these intestines are where the animal or the organism is going to be absorbing the nutrients from that food. The stomach really doesn't help us with absorption. There's a little bit there, but the main point of the stomach is for storage and to start digesting the material. Once it's kind of into this mushy material that's kind of like a paste, it travels through the intestines. And the longer the intestines, the more absorption of these nutrients can take place. And because we're dealing with an animal that eats plant matter, which again is an herbivore, that's important to know. Herbivores are animals that eat plants. Carnivores eat meat. And then omnivores, which is actually what we are considered, eat both. And so, again, looking at the intestinal tract of an herbivore, it's going to be much longer because its food it's digesting is a lot harder to process. Whereas a carnivore, like our fox here, look how short his large or his small intestines are. Those small intestines are fairly small because a lot of that material, that biological material, that meat, those bones, different things like that, it was able to be digested a lot better within the stomach, and so there's not as much to process as it goes through the intestines. And then even same with our large intestines here, which it's not labeled and it's kind of hard to tell, but after the cecum is what's referred to as the large intestines. Now, another thing on here, the reason I got this little fishy here, this little goldfish. Some of you may have heard before the fact that goldfish do not have stomachs. And that, for the most part, is true. They're not going to have a stomach like we consider a stomach. They have like a little sac there after they eat, but it doesn't work like a stomach like ours does. They basically just kind of eat their food, and then it goes through their intestines, they absorb as much as they can, and then they poop it out, and they do it all over again. And so there's really not a lot of internal storage for food for these fish, and that's why if you get a goldfish, they always tell you that you need to feed them at least twice a day because they are constantly eating that food and then pooping it out. There's really no storage like we have in a stomach to help slowly digest. And so there's your little factoid about fish. Last but not least, I want to talk about this guy. This is a wombat. Wombats are a type of marsupial from Australia, and when they go to the bathroom, so again, they are a type of herbivore. Their food goes through all the intestinal tract, through the large intestines, and then the waste, what they can't process, leaves through the anus. And their poop is unique among the animal kingdom because it comes out in cubes. Yes, that is real poop right there, and nobody has changed it. Nobody went with like a knife and cut it into little cubes like that. It comes out of the wombat looking just like that. Scientists aren't exactly sure why. Sometimes there are different muscles and bones that can affect how the poop comes out of the end, but scientists believe that the reason why it comes out in cubes like this is because wombats are very territorial, and they use their poop for marking their territory. And so the idea is that the reason that it's cubed is because a cube is not going to roll away like a round turd would. And so, because when it poops out these cubes, the cube doesn't move anywhere. That way they know exactly what's their territory. It's a weird animal, but it's a very interesting way that they end their digestive system tract. And so speaking about waste, last but not least, is the excretory system. This excretory system is how we get rid of waste specifically from the blood. So when we talk about getting rid of waste, we often think about, going to the bathroom in general. And that can include number 1 or number 2. But when we're talking about the excretory system and getting rid of waste, we're talking about waste specifically from our blood. In other words, we have too many salts that build up, or, we've used different foods and chemicals, and now we have this waste that are these amino acids and nitrogenous bases that we don't need. And in fact, if they were to stay in our body, they would be poisonous to us. And so our body needs to get rid of them. So we have these organs known as kidneys. And we actually have two of them. They're paired kidneys. And what these kidneys do is you can see that they are linked up to these huge veins and arteries. And that's because they have the important job of filtering all of your blood. And as the blood gets filtered through the kidneys, again, just like that, I mean, it's basically a filter. All the waste that doesn't belong is going to go down through this tube known as the ureter. And as it reaches the end, it's going to get to a location known as the urinary bladder. And I have to specify urinary because fish actually have a different type of bladder that we're going to be talking about later. But this urinary bladder fills up with all this nitrogenous waste, this ammonia and different things. And once it gets full, the body excretes it as urine, at least for us. We excrete, mammals excrete it as a urine, and the chemical that comes out is what's known as urea. But not all animals excrete waste that way. Fish specifically excrete ammonia, which again is very poisonous. And this is another reason that you need to have a good filter system on an aquarium, because if you don't, you have all these what are known as nitrates that build up from the ammonia, and it can actually kill your fish. And so you need good bacteria to help cancel that out. And then with birds and reptiles, what we often see is uric acid. Now, oftentimes we've seen this without even realizing it. If you've ever seen bird poop on a car or had the misfortune of it being on you, that white part of the bird poop is not poop. It's actually the uric acid. It's their waste from the blood that was filtered by their kidneys, and it's released as that white substance, that uric acid. Likewise, with a lot of reptiles, like with lizards, sometimes you'll see when they go to the bathroom, like if you have a pet lizard, maybe you've seen when they go to the bathroom, you have like, you know, the waste from the digestive system, and you also have this little white, it almost looks like a white stone. And what that white stone is that's the uric acid. Many reptiles try and keep as much water as they can, and so their urine, in a sense, doesn't come out like ours does, where it's very watery. Theirs actually comes out almost completely dry, and that's what that white part is. It's that uric acid. And so those are the major organ systems of vertebrae. All right, now one final thing that I kind of want to talk about. In the textbook, at the beginning it talks about ectotherms versus endotherms. And I kind of wanted to end here because this is what we're going to start going into. Specifically this chapter, it deals a lot with ectotherms, which oftentimes are considered the cold-blooded. And I want to make a distinction right now and let you know, just because we say it's cold-blooded does not mean their blood is cold. All right, so a lot of people don't like using the terms cold-blooded versus warm-blooded because it's a misinterpretation of what the animal's blood actually is. The animal's blood, if they are an ectotherm, ecto referring to outside, therm referring to temperature. In other words, their body temperature is based off the outside temperature. And these animals, if they are an ectotherm, they have no way of controlling that body temperature. It's just all based off the environment. And so if it's warm outside, they're going to be warm. If it's cold outside, their body temperatures are going to be cold. If it's warm, they're going to be able to do a lot more. They're going to be able to move a lot faster. If it's cold, they're going to be a lot slower, a lot more lethargic, perhaps even go into a state of hibernation. That happens oftentimes with reptiles and amphibians, known as brumation. And that's generally where we see ectotherms, is with amphibians and most reptiles and fish. And the reason I say most reptiles and fish is because it has been found out that some of them could possibly be warm-blooded. And when we say warm-blooded, we're talking about endotherms. Those are our mammals and birds. And what endo refers to as inside temperature, internal temperature. Endotherms, or warm-blooded animals, can maintain a constant body temperature. They can regulate their own temperature. They have a set temperature that their body is always at and should always be at. For example, take our bodies. Our body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's what it should stay at. It may fluctuate a degree or two, especially when we're doing certain activities, like if we're outside, it may increase. But our body has counteractive measures to help cool us down to make sure our body doesn't get too hot. So our body temperature is determined based off of our internal things. If it gets too hot, we sweat. If we get too cold, we shiver. Or in some animals' cases, if they live in cold environments, they have fur. If they live in very hot environments, sometimes they're going to sweat. But also, if we look at our African elephant here, they have very large ears. And one of the reasons that they have large ears isn't just so that they can hear, but it's actually to help them cool down, because they have a lot of capillaries that are close to the surface of the skin. And what these capillaries actually do is, again, they are allowing that transfer of carbon dioxide and oxygen inside the body. But when they're close enough to the outside, they actually help us to release heat. This is also the same reason that your face blushes when you are doing a lot of physical activity, or when you get hot and your face gets really red. It's red because of all those capillaries that are dilating and expanding, getting larger to try and release as much heat outside of the body as possible, because we are an endothermic creature. We are warm-blooded. So, to recap what we talked about in this video, vertebrates are animals with spinal cords and a vertebral column. They have specialized organ systems, which include a living skeleton. They have a circulatory system that's closed. They have a respiratory system, whether using gills or lungs to help them get their oxygen. They're going to have a specialized nervous system that's divided into a central and peripheral. They have a digestive system that can vary depending on if it's an herbivore, omnivore, or carnivore. And then last but not least, we have kidneys that help us to filter that blood, any waste that's in there. And then we also talked about how do we divide these animals based off their internal body temperature. Ectothermic creatures cannot control their own body temperature. Their body temperature is determined based off whatever their external environment is. So if it's 120 degrees outside, then the lizard's body is most likely going to be close to that temperature. If it's 50 degrees outside, it's going to be close to that temperature. Whereas endothermic creatures, like us, have an internal way of regulating their temperature. So if it is 150 degrees outside, we're going to try and stay as close to 98 degrees as possible. Or if it's 50 degrees outside, we're going to still try and maintain that 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's ectothermic versus endothermic. Your endothermic animals include mammals and birds, and then your ectothermic include your reptiles, amphibians, and fish, which brings us to fish. So I'm not going to talk about fish in this video because that's gone on long enough, but be on the lookout because there's going to be a short video that just kind of goes over a basic overview of the 3 different types of fish and what makes a fish a fish. Fishy, fishy.